So it seems like nobody likes the playoff system except for Ohio State and Notre Dame. The good news is the SEC is nowhere to be found this year. But something has to change to make the playoff system make sense. We'll tell you what that is coming up next. Welcome to the Big Ten Team Rivalry Show, where we cover the Big Ten from a Michigan perspective with expert trash talk and unrivaled analysis. My name is Cliff. His name is Mac. Let's get into it. Now, when the initial playoff brackets were released, the assumption was, barring an upset, whoever won in round one would likely lose in the quarterfinals because that's where the top four teams were. The exact opposite happened. All top four seeds were eliminated. Arizona State was arguably the only team to actually make it a good game. There's plenty of speculation about the 3 weeks off for the top four teams. Were they as ready as the bottom eight? Did the bottom eight have an advantage by playing a week before the quarterfinals? Now, we're not saying the championship is illegitimate in this discussion. Far from it. Ohio State and Notre Dame have earned their spot in the national championship by winning the games they needed to win, by enduring to this point. Still, the system has problems. Before we tell you how it should be fixed, let's talk about those problems. Mac, problem number one seems to be that neither Ohio State nor Notre Dame won a conference championship. Now, Notre Dame can't. They're not in a conference, but Ohio State lost to Michigan, and that means they lost out on the conference championship. Does that mean we need to get rid of conference championships, or should we just make those round one?
So there are a couple of different issues at play here. Let's handle this from the Ohio State side first. That would be the question of, do we get rid of conference championships or do we make those round one? So you don't get rid of conference championships. The conference, winning your conference needs to be important. And it should be, making those games round one. I also think that that's not, I don't think that that's the answer either. I think that there needs to be a system that blends the importance of winning regular season matchups and winning the conference. For instance, Clemson. Clemson's an interesting. Actually, let's go with Alabama here. Alabama is an interesting case study because they were in conversations of should they have gotten the nod at the 11 spot or the 12 spot over Arizona State. Arizona State got it because Arizona State, I think, won their conference, right? Arizona State won it because got it because Arizona State won their conference. Now, Arizona State, if you look at their schedule, they've got number 16 Utah, they've got a win over number 16 Kansas State, a win over number 14 BYU, a win over number 16 Iowa State. It's a good resume, okay, but they also have losses to Texas Tech and Cincinnati. Those are two extremely bad losses, but they won their conference. So if you look at Arizona State's, let's call it strength of schedule or resume, and you compare that to somebody like Alabama, this is kind of an enigma because Alabama lost to Vanderbilt. And they lost to Oklahoma. And against Oklahoma, they only managed 3 points. Those are two extremely bad losses. Does Alabama get in the playoffs over Arizona State simply because Alabama actually has a win over Georgia? So the answer is no. And the reason why I'm kind of trying to make this weird rambly example between Arizona State and Alabama is because Arizona State did what was asked for them. They at least won their conference championship. So that should be enough to get them into the playoffs. But actually, maybe a better example would have been comparing them against somebody like Clemson. Clemson got the number 12 spot. They had to play in the first round. Arizona State did not. Arizona State, I understand, had the close game against Texas, but Arizona State does not have the resume to back up a top four spot, which is why they were one of the teams to go down in that second round against Texas. With Texas being a far superior team, you would think, than Arizona State. Obviously, they had the close game. That was kind of an enigma, but I think it still stands that Arizona State didn't have the resume to back up a top four spot. And if you look at the final college football rankings or college football playoff rankings, Arizona State is ranked number 12. So according to the committee, Arizona State's resume is only good enough to get them just barely in the top 12, not in the top 4. So why are they getting rewarded with a first round bye when their strength of schedule, when their resume, their own resume by the committee's own admission, is just barely good enough to get into the playoffs? I think that the way they've got it set up, and I agree with Tom Fornelli on this. Tom Fornelli said in an article, I think he said it on the Cover 3 podcast a few times, that what they actually need to do for the conference championships, don't even one, but make it so that it is an extra boost into getting into the playoffs. That needs to be like winning your conference gets you an automatic bid. It doesn't get you a top 4 spot. It doesn't get you an automatic bye, but it gets you an automatic bid. Because in no world should Arizona State be getting a bye, but Texas has to play in the first round.
How does that work as an automatic bid then? Let's say, let's take Michigan, for example. Let's say Michigan actually ends up being ranked 14. I don't know how this would work. This is all going to be hypothetical, obviously, but let's say they get ranked in the top 20. Let's say they're 20. Mm-hmm. They make it into the Big Ten conference championship. They win the conference championship. Let's say they beat Ohio State in that case, and they move up to 13. Where does that put them then in the CFP bracket?
They're
not in the top 12, but they won their conference championship.
Well, then they're in the bracket. They're in the CFP at that point. That gets you an automatic in. It doesn't get you an automatic bye. Because like if you take an 11-2 Michigan, but with a win over Ohio State, or I'm sorry, take a 12-1 Michigan with a conference championship. And let's pretend that the scenario that we were all hoping would play out actually played out, and Michigan and Ohio State met in the conference championship. Michigan wins the conference championship. They go 12-1. Let's say they had a regular season loss against somebody, and let's say they were good. Ohio State ends the season, though, with a record of, let's see, they go to the conference championship, so 12 games, 13 games. So let's say they were 11-2. Okay, but both of those schedules are really good. They're in a really good conference. Chances are they're playing a really good schedule, so their strength of schedule puts them really high up in the rankings. Michigan gets the automatic bid, but does Ohio State get overlooked for a spot? No, at that point, Michigan's 12-1 with a conference championship. That should be enough to put them into the top 4. But I think the problem that this hypothetical illustrates is that the whole thing is extremely subjective. Now, college basketball kind of has this down. You know, there are a lot of teams that don't make the 64, 68, 64, the playoffs, despite having or relatively decent resumes, or resumes that you would think would be good enough to get in, but they don't get in because they didn't win their conference championship, and somebody else, maybe with a worse record, but they won their conference championship, has that over that team. And there are conference champions in men's college basketball, or college basketball in general, that end up with 16 seeds. So a conference championship should not guarantee a first round bye or a top 4 spot. That should be determined by strength of record. The problem that we all have in wrapping our minds around this is that the strength of record is extremely subjective. It really is. And the Michigan-Ohio State game is the perfect illustration as to how subjective that is. Because in no universe does anyone look at Michigan and Ohio State on paper and say, yeah, Michigan's going to win this. I mean, right. You don't say that with any bit of confidence, but they did win. So does that mean Michigan should all of a sudden be in the playoffs? No, because they lost to 5 other teams. Right. But Ohio State got knocked out of the conference championship conversation. Okay, well, that sucks. But their only other loss was against number 1 Oregon. So yeah, they totally dropped the ball against Michigan, and they have the loss against Oregon, but you know, that's a pretty solid loss. So what are you going to do with that team? Well, you kind of put their record up against a lot of the other teams, and you say, okay, Ohio State subjectively is good enough to put them in the 12-team field. Now they need to prove it. And so far they have. And that's kind of, I think, what you hope as a committee member is that you're subjectively looking at these schedules and saying, the eye test says, or at least the paper says, that Ohio State would probably beat anybody. And I have a feeling that Michigan game was an enigma. That was an outlier. That should not have happened. It did, and it's hilarious, but it shouldn't have happened. And so as a committee member, you're saying, okay, I believe based on what I see from Ohio State's record is that the Michigan loss was an enigma. I'm going to go ahead and put them in anyway. I can't really remember why we were going off on that tangent, but the point being,
the fact that if a team is not ranked in the top 12, I think I went overboard on the hypothetical, but just saying if a team is not ranked in the top 12 but wins their conference championship, where do they end up in the playoffs? If the playoffs are 12 teams, you've got top 12 teams, you're going to have to knock somebody out of the top 12 to put a conference championship in the top 12.
Well, and that's exactly what happened. Let's see here. Clemson jumped. I guess
that's true. Alabama was knocked out for Arizona State, I believe.
Yeah.
Because Alabama
Alabama's number 11. Arizona State got the 11 spot, I think. Yeah, they got the 11 spot. No, they didn't. Arizona State got the 4 spot, but they should have gotten the 11 spot. And then Clemson jumped, according to the final college football playoff rankings, goodness, Clemson jumped South Carolina, Ole Miss, and Miami and ended up in the 12 spot. And that's with Clemson having lost to Louisville, South Carolina, and Georgia. So Clemson actually jumped a team that they lost to into the playoffs because they won a conference championship. So that's where the subjectivity of this kind of comes into play. Because then at that point, are you putting in South Carolina over, I don't know, what's another, Tennessee? Are you putting in South Carolina over Tennessee? I mean, probably not, because South Carolina has 3 losses. Tennessee, I don't believe did. I don't know how many losses Tennessee did or had. Looks like they had 2 losses. So Tennessee had 2 losses. I'm guessing their strength of record was also much stronger. Yeah, they've got wins against Oklahoma, Alabama, NC State. Pretty dominant win against NC State. But I guess that's kind of the point I'm making, is that it's very subjective, and I think that makes people really uncomfortable. With basketball, it makes maybe a little bit more sense because of the sheer amount of teams. I mean, there's 64 teams. If you can't do enough to prove that you belong in the top 64 of college basketball, then but there are still debates as to whether or not somebody should have gotten into that 64th spot. Like, geez, guys, at that point, be happy with the NIT, all right? But with college football, you've only got 12 spots, and you've got 132 teams that, well, realistically, you won't really only have about 20 or 25 teams that all believe that they have a resume that's deserving of getting in there. So I think that makes things a lot more sensitive.
All right. Well, problem number 2, then, you're talking about subjectivity. This one is even more subjective, I think, but we're talking about regular season games. And do they still matter? Neither Ohio State or Notre Dame would have made the 14 playoff last year due to losses in the regular season. So is being undefeated a problem, or not being undefeated, I should say, is that a problem? And when we look at the Super Bowl in the NFL, only one Super Bowl team, and that's the 1972 Miami Dolphins, went undefeated and won the Super Bowl. Mm-hmm. What do we do about regular season games now? Do the regular season games still matter as much as they used to with regard to the playoffs?
No, they don't. I mean, I think it's pretty much everyone would say that if we had a 4-team playoff this year, Ohio State would not be in it. Mm-hmm. Because of the loss to Michigan. I mean, look, by the college football playoffs own admission, these are the final college football rankings. Ohio State, this is came out right after the conference championship games were played. Ohio State's ranked 6. And I mean, that's up there for sure, but it's not top 4, is it?
Right.
So it's not good enough to get up there. And it's likely they drop all the way down to 6 because of the Michigan game. Now, I understand that the committee is probably looking at the Michigan game. Like I said, it's an enigma. That shouldn't have happened. But it did. And that has an effect on these things. So if this were the 14 playoff, no, they shouldn't belong in there. But by the nature of expanding the playoff to 12 teams, I mean, it's pretty much a law of, I was going to say physics, but definitely economics, that the more you have of something, the less that thing is worth. That's why inflation exists. The more dollars are in circulation, the less the dollar is worth. The more games you have in the playoffs, the more spots available, the less those spots are worth, or the less the games are worth to get into those spots. So yeah, Ohio State can lose in bizarre fashion to a not very good Michigan team, and that by itself inherently means that the regular season does not matter as much. It still does a little bit. If Ohio State had dropped a third game, they probably would have been out. But right now, it at the very least means that the regular season doesn't matter as much as it used to.
So then conference championships need to change. Regular season games, we've talked about before, regular season games that there could be coaches on the fringe of the top 12 playing that calculus now of, can I afford to lose this game and still make it to the playoffs? Which is an interesting discussion in and of itself, just from the strategy standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
But now let's look at the playoff structure moving forward. There's talks about going to 14 teams. At one point there was talks about going to 16 teams, expanding the playoffs even further. In this case, what we're talking about, let's go back to step one here. All of the top 4 teams were knocked out in the quarterfinals, meaning teams 8 through 12 were in the semifinals and now the national championship. So our final question then, is this the way it should be, or would you make a change to the playoff structure?
I wouldn't make a change to the playoff structure. I would, as a fan, I have to be okay with subjectivity, because college football is such a big sport. There are so many teams that it's going to take a lot of restructuring. And I know that the Big Ten and the SEC have kind of already, the rumor is that they've already played with the idea of a super conference, and that they're kind of talking about it and kind of looking at structuring things towards the NFL model, where you've got the different divisions and stuff like that. And yeah, it's important to win your division, but they're not going off of quality of wins. They're going off of quantity. Did you win more games than the other teams? Yeah, then you're in. And that's really the purest system. But until they restructure all of college football into that NFL system, you're going to need to be okay with some subjectivity. And again, it makes more sense in college basketball, where there are 64 teams. Again, if you're not good enough to make the top 64, then you really shouldn't be complaining about whether or not you deserve that 64th spot. You have no shot at a national title at that point. Mm-hmm. But if you're number 13 Miami, and you're like, well, we're in the number 13 spot, and we're getting overlooked just because we lost to, Georgia Tech and Syracuse. So that's not a good example, but still, they're the number 13 team. I mean, they're probably making all sorts of excuses as to why they should be the number 12 team. I mean, they've got no ranked wins. Yeah, they shouldn't be anywhere near that 12 spot, although they blew out everybody for the most part when they won, except for Cal and Virginia Tech. But I digress. In any case, the point is that you're always going to have these arguments. Who gets that last spot? And if you want the conference championships to mean anything, then they need to mean something in the sense that they can get you into the playoffs. But your strength of record needs to be what determines how you're seeded. And that's what Tom Fornelli was saying in this article. And he has the playoffs laid out by the final CFP rankings, or I think by their Sagarin rankings and stuff like that too. Somehow or another, he takes that into account. But if you take the final CFP rankings and build out a tournament based on that, all of a sudden it makes a lot more sense. You've got number 1 Oregon, number 2 Georgia, number 3 Texas, number 4 Penn State. Penn State gets a bye. Why does Penn State get a bye, but Arizona State has to play in the first round when Arizona State was the one who won their conference? Because Penn State has a better strength of schedule than Arizona State. They just do. I'm sorry, the Big Ten is just a better conference. But is that an opinion or is that a fact? How do we measure that when the conferences are so different, when schedules are so different from each other? And it's not like Arizona State can help that either. And these are all the questions that the CFP committee is going to need to take into account. And my fear is that what they're going to do is just expand the playoffs even further rather than restructuring college football in a way that would make sense, in a way that would value the number of wins over a subjective determination of quality of wins. And so what they'll end up doing is just expanding the playoff to 14, 16, 18, 20 some odd teams so that everybody just stops arguing. And at that point you say like, okay, you got to believe that the top 20 teams can't possibly, or someone outside of the top 20 can't possibly have a shot at a national championship, right? Well,
stranger things happen. Yeah.
Stranger things have happened, but also at that point, why even play a regular season? Just start the season with the tournament. Just randomly seed the teams and see what happens. That's the problem is that they're going to expand the playoffs so much that the regular season just means nothing.
Or is at least diminished.
The thing is next time win more games and leave no doubt. That's what you can do.
Yeah. But ultimately, you would say you're against expanding beyond 12 teams or beyond 14 teams?
12. And I don't even really like 12 anymore at this point.
Well, we'll leave it right there. Thanks for watching. Let us know what you think about what we think by leaving a comment below. If you want to see more college football stories like this, be sure to give us a like. And while you're there, slide to the left and give us a subscribe. That lets us know that you are interested in what we're doing here. Mac, take us out.
This is the Big Ten Team Rivalry Show.